So let's get on to the the main part of the webinar, and we will follow through this agenda, sub agenda I will call. So let's start with little agile overview. I don't know how many of you know about agile, or how many you have are hearing it first time. I doubt there will be anyone hearing for the first time, but still that's okay. But let me give a little recap about agile in a couple of slides. uh, so most of you would have seen this agile manifesto, that I call it the value system for agile, where the things on the left have are more valuable than the things on the right. So this is the core philosophy of agile. So any agile project, any agile development, any agile work will encompass most of these in some way or the other. And if you are not doing that, you are more on the right side, then you are not moving towards uh, agile. So there is a journey that a company, a team, a person has to go through, a transformation journey where they move from philosophically and also from the value system perspective, from right to left. So once you have fully moved to the left, then you become agile. And there are ways to do that. This may be very abstract, uh, but then you get into the details of the principles of agile. So there are 12 principles of agile, and that again helps you to become agile or transform to agile if you start practicing these principles. And you may not be able to practice all of them all of a sudden. So you may start your journey and start following some, and then do more, and then do more, and then do more. So, and then there are several practices. I'm not going there, but so those are the values, principles, and then most of you will know that it is agile is iterative. You divide the whole product functionality into smaller pieces and deliver those pieces in smaller iterations or sprints. And then at the end of each sprint, you get feedback from your customer, and you inspect and adapt, so you improve. So agile is iterative. That's what I wanted to say in this slide, that it is iterative. It is highly customer focused. You interact with the customer. Product owner is your the representative from the customer side, and he or she works very closely with the team. And also it is highly data driven. So at the end of each sprint, at the end of each iteration, you collect data. What was the velocity of the team? What was the quality? How much was the rework? What is the technical debt that team has accumulated? How team is doing on those? So those are some of the metrics that you collect at the end of each sprint, and then review and inspect and then improve. So iterative, customer focus, and data driven. Just 2 or 3 slides talking about agile. If somebody wants to learn more about agile, that's a different topic. Um, with that background, let's talk about uh, the differences between requirement gathering in the two types of projects or product development. So in Waterfall, the requirements are gathered upfront. All requirements for the entire product or project are gathered up for detailed out upfront, signed up on upfront. Where in Agile, they are gathered just in time. So you start listing down the requirements that are most important, and then you start gathering those requirements, start eliciting those requirements. And once those are over, then you go to the next, then you go to the next, then you go to the next. So they are gathered just in time versus gathered all up front. And in Waterfall, requirement can only be changed with a change request. It's a very formal way of changing the requirement, adding new feature functions. Whereas in Agile, it's a very informal way. If any new requirement comes, it goes into the backlog, gets reprioritized. You can add requirements, change requirements, whatever is important to the customer. It is customer focused, so whatever is important to the customer, that is what goes into the requirements backlog and gets reprioritized. And in Waterfall, normally they are documented, a very detailed documentation. We call it business requirement documents. In case of Agile, those are captured in backlog as epics and user stories. So that's a very simple way of documenting requirements. Normally, each story, which is the the basic unit of requirements, is not very long. It's supposed to come on an index card, 3x5 index card. So it's small. It's very small, and you may have multiple of those cards. It could be physical cards, or it could be electronic cards, or you may use a tool to write those requirements. And those are not a big BRDs kind of requirement. And once a story is implemented, then it normally you don't come back to it. You don't have to even, it goes out of the backlog. It is not even in the backlog, goes out. So it's not in your kind of vision, or it's not in kind of your horizon that you look for. It's just gone, it's done. Whereas BRD, you look at all the times. This may be 200, 300, 400 page document that is kept. You keep an eye on this all the times. And of course, they are delivered at the end of the project in Waterfall, whereas they are delivered at the end of each sprint. So the question is that, do you see any other difference in your environment between requirement gathering in Waterfall and Agile project? I know many of you work in environments where some of your projects are Waterfall and some of your projects are Agile. So what difference do you see? We'll use the chat box again over here to talk about this. Anybody, any other difference that you see between Agile and Waterfall requirements gathering? I'll just pause a little bit. You're thinking. Anyone can think of any other? No, I am not seeing anything over here. Okay, scope creep. Scope creep. Very, very good. Very good question here about this, or very good observation about the scope creep here. So, so I want to tell you, Liz, there is nothing like a scope creep in Agile projects. There is nothing like a scope creep, because you don't have fixed scope. Scope is the one thing that's variable in Agile projects. So you have your time and cost fixed. I think you may remember my diagram from one of the trainings that you attended, inverted triangle. And that's a very hard concept, or a very hard mindset change. So there is nothing like a scope creep in Agile projects. If you have new requirements, they are added to the backlog wherever they go in the order of priority. And the team keeps working on the highest priority requirements from the top of the backlog. So scope creep is a big issue in Waterfall. I think we should add that into this chart here. Scope creep is a big issue in Waterfall, and managing scope is a big issue in Waterfall. But that's not an issue at all in Agile, because the scope is not fixed. There is nothing like a baselining of scope like you do in Waterfall. Waterfall, you baseline the scope, and based on that baseline, you create cost and schedule, cost and time, and you baseline scope, you baseline time, you baseline cost, and then any change that comes, that change is evaluated with the reference frame of that baseline. So that's a project management work that every project manager will do in Waterfall projects. They have the baselines, and if anything changes in the scope, then the other baselines will change. And it's not a easy thing. It's a painful thing to manage scope in Waterfall projects. Agile, there is no such thing. Okay, any other? Let's move on. But that was a good thing, Liz. That was a good point you brought up. So Waterfall requirement gathering, what are the pros and what are the cons of in Waterfall? So the good part is that all the requirements are gathered upfront, so there is a clarity about the entire project. So you have you know what exactly user needs or the customer needs, and you have everything detailed out to the extent possible. So there's a higher level of clarity in Waterfall environment, and also it helps in estimating the entire project, because that's what is needed in Waterfall environment. That based on the requirements, the scope of the project, you need to come up with the estimate. So if you don't do the entire requirement gathering upfront, you can't do the estimate. Whereas in in Agile projects, the estimates have not so much significance in terms of how much the total will cost, or how much the total project will take. And also it is easier to trace complete requirements through RTM. Normally you will have that in Waterfall world, so you will be able to trace them. The downsides are the requirement may get obsolete, and that happens many times, particularly for larger project where you are more than 3 or 4 month project, and as the project duration gets longer and longer, you have more and more of this problem, and that's a big problem, because you start with so much clarity in the beginning, but then very soon, in 4, 5, 6 months, the requirement starts getting obsolete, because the situations change, the business situation change, and lot of things happen in those months, and the context is lost. Estimates, normally there is estimation is an art and a science, so it takes a skill to estimate, and most of the time we have seen that estimates can be off by the time project finishes. So that's one of the downside, because the changes may happen, the requirements may not be understood, and things like that. And of course, if the projects get longer, the stakeholders may add more requirements that then are needed, because nothing is delivered. So they say, oh, if it is going to be delivered in 6 months, can we add this more? Or if it's going to be delivered in a year, can we add more? So you can see what are the good things about Waterfall requirement gathering, and what is the downside. And most of you may be familiar with these. So let's move on to Agile part. What are the pros and cons of doing Agile requirement gathering? So the first part is that they are gathered just in time. So the advantage of gathering just in time is that the requirements are always current. They never become obsolete, because they are gathered in time, and they are developed in time, they are delivered in time. So they never become obsolete. So, but the downside is that you have to keep doing it. You have to keep doing it all through the project. So you are never like if you are of that mindset of completing all the requirement upfront, then it becomes little kind of an uneasy situation. Like, oh, we keep doing requirements. So that could come in mind, and it just happens very, very frequently. Uh, and the good part of agile requirement, another is good part is facilitating communication through user stories. And that communication facilitation happens with the users and the customers, and that frequent communication helps understand customers very well and throughout the duration of the project. Whereas in waterfall you do it on the beginning. uh, but the downside is sometimes the customer says that, we don't have time, or it's difficult to get customer involved in requirement gathering process. They may not commit. In those situations, it will be difficult. So the downside is that you need customer to participate. The good part is that it helps in facilitating communication, helps in understanding customer. But if they don't participate, then everything becomes very, very challenging. Um, so that's another difference, pros and cons of this. And the last one, as I was talking about, that agile requirements stay up to date all the times, but then you require frequent grooming. You have to keep detailing out requirement. You start from a big theme or a epic, and then you keep grooming that into smaller stories, and stories are discussed, details are gathered. So you keep grooming that. So you have to spend time in grooming. And I was actually working with one of the teams, and we were talking about their velocity. And then one of the team members came up that we are spending so much time in grooming their stories, so there is a time going towards grooming that is not accounted for in in velocity, because that time is needed before the story is ready to be implemented, which is a very right thing. So those are the kind of challenges you face when you do the agile requirement gathering. But all of that is very, very helpful, as we saw in the previous slide, that uh, requirement gathering using agile is really, really beneficial. And does anybody know any of the other downsides of agile requirement gathering? Any downsides that you can think of? Okay, let's keep moving. Um, so what are the different forms for agile business requirement? Good news is that it's very simple. There are only two: user stories and epics. That is all. Okay. So, and if some of you have done have seen the user stories, you know that this is a is a requirement. Every user story is a requirement, and there is a particular format in which you write user stories. Like here, as a loan officer, I want to know a credit rating so that I can approve loan. So you see the three parts here. The part one is who needs this requirement, or who this requirement is needed, and then what the requirement is and why this is needed. So there are three components of a user story, and all the stories are organized in this way, so you know who needs it, what they need it, why they need it. And for each requirement you do that, and normally you will use a story card, uh, and If you are not using a story card, you may use a tool. If you use a tool such like Jira or version 1 or whatever is your tool, then have whatever tool you're using. So that's the uh, basic part of agile requirement, user stories. And this is, and so you have, I was talking about user story 3 parts, and so each card will have all those 3 parts. Plus there are other 3 parts of the story, like one is just the story, the description of the story, and then you will have what you call as conversation, knowing description more about that particular user story. What are the boundary conditions? What are the examples? Maybe there is a UI attached to it. Maybe there are certain conditions, there are certain constraints, and all that thing go in something called as conversation. So all the details about that story that go under conversation, and then the confirmation part is how you're going to test, how you are going to know that your requirement is implemented correctly. This is you can call it an acceptance criteria too. So from that background, you can call it an acceptance criteria. So you have the story, you have the details about the story, and you have the acceptance criteria. So that becomes a complete story. So without conversation and confirmation, the story description is not complete. So if you just line those, write just 1 or 2 lines, then it is not complete. And these 2 parts are actually handled through the grooming process. So you write one single line like particularly this one: as a loan officer, I want to know credit rating so that I can approve loan. Now, if you look at it, if a developer looks at it, then he may have questions. He may have questions. Then are we talking about credit rating from one bureau or all 3 bureaus? That a kind of a question came to my mind, right? You may have other questions that will come to your mind if you were to develop this user story, if you have to write code for this user story. And that actually, those answers to those questions go in the conversation part. Maybe there is a screen where you are going to input the person's detail to get the credit rating. How does that screen look like? Maybe you will get the rating, the system gives you the rating in what format that rating should look like. And do you want for a particular period of time? Do you want the current rating, or there could be many questions. So they all go under conversation part, the look and feel and the UI, and all go under the conversation part. And then how you're going to test, what is the acceptance criteria, that go under the confirmation. So for a complete story, you write the story, which has 3 parts, like as a role, the user, who wants to do it, who needs it, what they need, why they need, and then the details about the story, and then the acceptance criteria. So that goes for each story, and that is all that you need for your requirements. You don't need anything more than this. Don't need anything more than this. For each story, you need this. And also, as a business analyst, if you're writing the user story, or whosoever is writing the user stories, they need to make sure that each user story follows the invest criteria. This is a kind of a test. Is it a good user story or not? What are the good, what we will call a good user story? So is it independent? So if you write a user story, then does it depend on other user story? Now, if it depends on other user story, guess what? Both need to be developed in the same sprint. So is it negotiable? Like if you have different parts of the story, then can you implement some part and not implement some part? And So is it negotiable? Is it valuable? For sure, because does customer value it? And if it is not valuable, then there is no point doing it. So is it valuable, estimable? Can a developer or the development team look at that story and estimate it? And it is small, so that it can be finished within a sprint or iteration. And of course, testable. There is a test criteria, and it is testable or not. So every user story need to have conversation and confirmation, and need to be aligned to the invest criteria. That's a very simple thing. So if I have to teach somebody to write user stories, that is what they write. They will still need those same skills what they needed in waterfall environment, to do elicitation, to have a communication, to talk to the customer, interpersonal skills, and all those kind of things. You still need all those kind of things. But the way you write requirements is way different. In case of waterfall, you may write use cases. You don't have to write use cases here. As you know, some of you who would have written the use cases, is it requires some skill, some training, or to write use cases. You need to be trained on that. But writing user story is much simpler. You may need a little bit of training if you have not done this in the past, but probably that's not going to be as involved as writing the use cases. So very simple way of creating requirements in agile projects. I'll pause here for a minute to see if there are any questions. Okay, if you have any questions, you can put it at the end. Okay, let's keep moving. And then, of course, epics are a group of related user stories. So many times you start with that one line description of story, and then as you get into conversation, then, oh, this is big, cannot be done in one sprint. And that is what this differentiates between epic and story. A story can be finished within a sprint. If that cannot be finished within a sprint, then it is not a story, it is an epic. So epic is implemented in multiple sprints, but a story is implemented within one sprint. Now, sometime it happens that at the end of the sprint, you have unfinished stories. You might have seen that. Does that mean those stories are epics? Not necessarily. And it depends upon how the team works on those stories. What is the capability, and all those, are they follow the invest criteria, they're dependent stories. So there are a lot of factors that come into play. So usually, if a story follows the invest criteria, then it is a story, because it's going to be small, it's going to be independent, it could be finished in a sprint, it will be. And if that story is unfinished, that's okay, it may not be an epic. But many times, the developers or the product owners or the business analysts are not able to break larger stories into smaller ones, and that larger stories take multiple sprints. So that actually becomes an epic. So epic is a group of related stories, and it is a much bigger, you can call it user story, and that can be implemented over multiple sprints. So you will not introduce epic into a sprint. So you will introduce only user stories in sprints, because that's what the development team is supposed to be taking and finishing. So epic is a much larger thing. Maybe it may contain 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 user stories, which can be taken up in different sprints. So epic usually may take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sprints, even more, but a user story need to finish within a sprint. So that's the distinction. There is no different way of writing epics. I call epics are larger user stories. That is a simple way of saying that, what is it, what is epic. So there is no other definition for epic, but I just wanted to put it here, and so that there are distinctions. So the epics and stories. Sometimes you may say, oh, there is a feature also. Well, that's fine. The feature is also a set of user stories. So that will get implemented over a period of time. So sometimes in some places you will find epic is a much larger thing. So epic could be, you can start epic may have multiple features, and features may have stories. Well, that's fine. It's not an issue. So I use any other form of requirement in a loose manner other than user story. That's the building block. That's the fundamental for each agile project. You need to have user stories. You can have epics, you can have features, you can have themes. So those are all fine, but the basic unit of requirement is user story. Okay, there are some questions. I will take them at the end. Now, what are the different ways of gathering requirements? So the very first thing is brainstorming. You sit down with the users or customers, start talking about user stories. Maybe sometimes you start writing them. You start brainstorming. You know the process of brainstorming, that everybody puts their ideas, and then the ideas are then sorted out, and you can come up with your final user stories. So that's a very common technique. Many of you are very familiar with brainstorming, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here. Wireframes. I think that's a very powerful technique of gathering requirement, particularly the UI, the user interface. So and it's a very informal process. So you have the users, customers, whosoever is involved in that user story. They may go to a room, and the person who is writing the user story, product owner, business analyst, team member, whosoever is writing that, or the customer itself, can stand up on the board and they start drawing like this. They start drawing on the board how that looks like, and then other people who are present, they ask questions, provide suggestions, feedback. So things may be erased, rewritten, redrawn, and I can tell you that you can develop a very reasonably complex, I'm not saying very, very complex or not very, very simple UI, probably in about a couple of hours. In couple of hours you can do. I do this in my classes, and I do this as an exercise, and people select a project, and then they have user stories, and for each user story I say, okay, pick up a user story and write down develop 2 UIs using wireframes. It doesn't take a lot of time. A group of 4 or 5 people working on it takes about maybe 30 minutes. Of course, that they are not expert on that, but I can tell you, if you have right people in the room, if you follow this technique of a UI development called as wireframe in agile world, you can actually develop average complexity UIs in a couple of hours. Try it out, and you will find it to be very, very useful. Some of you who, if you start with the development team, if you bring developers at this stage, they will start going into the developing a prototype. So I'll say, don't bring users. Don't bring developers. This is a requirement thing which the user community, customers, business community need to do. No developers involved here. So once you are done, then you can give it to developer. Now they want to do a prototype, or they want to develop straight from there. That's up to them. Most of the development teams will take this straight and develop. There is no need of prototyping. Cuts down on prototyping. And of course, this user interviews is an old technique. You go and talk to the SME or customer, or the power user customer, and interview that person or those persons, and write your or complete your user stories working with them. So many of you may be using this technique in your waterfall world. Is same applied to agile, but the focus is not on the entire set of requirements. Focus is on the limited set of stories. So that's the distinction, and you have the format of the user story that you are following. So it's pretty structured, and you can be very, very simple. Observation. This is another technique. So if you are developing an application or a product for something that is now done manually, so you can go and watch how a person does that work. You can talk to them, you can see, you can sit down. So if you are automating a help desk work, then you can go and sit with the help desk person and see how they work, what they do, and you can get feedback from them, and you can develop your user story and then talk to them that this is what they captured. But you can just sit down and observe. That's another technique. The most useful technique that I find is user writing workshops. So that's where all the right people come in the room, and they just start writing user stories. And this is very useful during the initial stage, what I call as product planning or release planning, where all the business people who are related to this project or product, the product owner, business analyst, only business people. So they come here, they start writing stories one by one. So they may use the board, or they may use the index cards. They may go over each story one by one, add the conversation part of it, add the acceptance criteria to that. And it's if you do like half day or full day workshop, user story writing workshop, really you can write significant amount of user stories that are important. Those that are not important, you may just put a liner there, one line there, and say, okay, we'll come back to it. So, but if you need the user stories for next maybe 3, 4, 5 sprints, you can do it really in a 1 or 2 day workshop, and you can knock it down. And remember that whenever you write stories, this is you cannot complete that story writing in one go. It will go through several iterations. So let's say you had a story writing workshop and you wrote the user stories, but when in the grooming process, when it goes through the detailing out, or when it goes for estimation, you may have detailed out some here, but when it goes for estimation, you bring the development team in. So, okay, here's the user story we want to develop, let's estimate it. At that point of time, the development team will have multiple questions, and those questions will clarify requirements and also clarify the acceptance criteria, and then that estimation can happen. So that refinement happens when you estimate and you do your release planning. The further refinement to the story can happen when it is picked up for the sprint, and when the development team start thinking how they're going to implement it. They may start dividing them into tasks and start thinking about tasks. So at that time, the story may get further refined. So there are multiple iterations that take place to take a story from the start to under deployment. Multiple iterations of the story. So it is not completely detailed out until done, kind of a thing. So you can see how the iterative nature of Agile is applied to the requirements. It is done in iterations. Even each story goes through iterations before it is picked up for the sprint and deployed. Okay, and then of course questionnaires is another technique that you can use to do requirement gathering for Agile projects. It's the downside is that it's a one-way communication. Normally people don't respond to questionnaires. Maybe 20-30% people may respond to questionnaire, but this is another technique to gather information. In some cases, that this may work pretty well. So you can try different ways of gathering requirements. My favorite is story writing workshop, as I told you, and the wireframes for the UI. So if I were to do, if I'm the product owner, I will do those two techniques and no other technique, and that should be good enough. So question. So what do you think? What techniques you can use and or cannot use in your organization? I'll pause. I'll look at some of the questions that have come up here, but I'm seeking for that that input. So what are these techniques? Any response? And then which technique, or which is your most favorite requirement gathering technique? If it is not there, you may have another technique that I have not listed. Anybody? I like workshops. Okay. Somebody said I like workshop. I want to look into the wireframes. I haven't done it. Had to do workshop with remote teams. Yeah. And there are tools that you can use, Aaron, to do to collaborate, and you must be using some tools to do that collaboration, so that everybody can. Okay, so your name of your tool is D. Okay. Hard to do workshop. Yes. That is true. It's true. But that's the kind of reality we live in. There are most of the projects or teams are remote. They're remote teams, and even the remote team may not be at one place. Like it may be distributed all across. So it's some of the IBM teams that I work with. They are so distributed that it is almost impossible to find a 30-minute or a 1-hour time slot where everybody can be together without somebody waking up like middle of the night. So it's hard, particularly in that situation. So you have to come up with the solution or the way that is not ideal but still optimized. Yeah. And that's doable. Okay. So what is BA's role in agile project? Story writing. That's what BAs do in an agile project. They write story with the product owner or for the product owner. If product owner is a very senior person, may not have time, so they may write user stories. Product owner may also write, but sometimes the business analyst will write user stories for the product owner, and product owner will prioritize, will talk to the stakeholders, talk to the customers, and will prioritize the user stories. And so that's one thing that a business analyst will do, write user stories. Of course, yeah, that format. Other thing is they develop the wireframes. So the wireframe is a huge component of story, whatever story involves UI. So you create the wireframe. So that will be another thing that that a BA may do. Sometimes for the remote teams, you may use like Microsoft Visio, Photoshop, PowerPoint, Excel. And there are whiteboards now available in many of the tools that you can use a whiteboard to draw the picture, and others can comment on that and can erase and redraw, and all those kind of things you can do. So that's another thing that BAs can do on agile in the context of agile requirement gathering. They may also maintain and update the product backlog. So What does that mean is that they can groom the user stories, and they may develop one-liner descriptions or features. They may groom them, they may make it bigger, and they may break larger stories into smaller stories, move stories up and down based on the priorities, and also help product owner in prioritization. So they can write stories, they can do wireframes, they can maintain and update product backlog, and of course they will support the development team with to help them estimate user stories, and during the development they will support them with their questions, because the development team may come up with questions during the development, and then the BAs are there to respond to uh, those kind of questions. So they play a pretty big role in agile projects as well. And then the difference between traditional and an agile BA. So it is. I don't want to go and read all of this. You can read, but the core part is that it follows the differences between traditional and agile projects. So that's where, like a sign off. So there's nothing like sign off in agile projects, whereas in waterfall projects you sign off on the BRD. You make sure that the customers or the stakeholders sign off, sponsors sign off the requirement, whereas in agile you don't require to be part of any kind of sign off, and long turnaround in traditional versus agile, a quick turnaround. So you can see the differences between the BA roles in traditional and agile world. Okay, so in conclusion, gathering requirement differs greatly between the two, and you need to learn what are the differences, need to have a pulse about your environment, and see what techniques or tools work best in your environment, and you can start practicing those skills, and so that you become effective in gathering requirements or help the team members or business analysts who are gathering requirements for you. Okay, so that concludes the presentation. I also, before I go to Q&A, I also want to tell you our next one is first steps towards agility. So that is on Monday, July 9th. And actually we are doing in collaboration with projectmanagement.com. So they are going to be a much bigger audience, and that will be held on a Monday, because that's what worked out with them. Instead of Wednesday, we'll have it on Monday. So the registration process is same. You go to our website, and from there you will find a link to projectmanagement.com, and you register, and so that's a little different next time. It is going to be through projectmanagement.com. Agile videos I was talking about. If you want to introduce people with agile basics, there's a online class, an online video on agile fundamentals. So you can learn agile, in an online, on-demand kind of a thing. Next class is on leadership skills for managers. It's an online class on July 18, from morning to evening Central Time. So if you are looking for developing some of the leadership skills, this may be a good class. This is another class that is in very high demand, and I have done it several times. Okay, now coming back to how can we gather requirement for a very technical integration project without actually defining. Okay, so Mike, if this is a technical integration, then of course the requirements are going to be technical. And like you saying that we may accidentally define the technical solution, I think you will do that. Because in case of business requirements, you basically define the business solution. You define the business solution and then start gathering requirement for the business solution. So if your project is technical integration, you may end up doing it. So this is natural. So I will say this is natural. There's nothing unusual here. it seems to be pretty, pretty reasonable to do that. So yeah, you may define technical solution, and you may also find out that that technical solution was not good after you started doing requirement. You may tweak that technical solution as you go forward. So that's pretty reasonable. Can I be agile in a what? Yes, you can be agile in, and that's what about first steps towards agility. Our next month webinar. You can do lot many things. You can implement lot many agile principles through agile practices, even in waterfall projects. And that is why that first step toward agility is getting so much traction, because people may have situations, project managers work in situations that they cannot change the organization. They cannot change the way PMOs work, but how they can still be agile. And that is what that webinar next month will help you understand that. So yes, the answer to that question is yes, you can be agile in a waterfall project, absolutely. Okay, so let's take some questions. I see some of the questions here. Let's say I saw some question. Would you ever advise having a developer write user stories, or this should be? So I will say there is no harm in developer writing a user story if they understand business. There is no harm. Anybody can write user story in an agile project. Most of the time, it's the business people who write user stories, but nothing stops a developer to write user stories. Then there's somebody asking, our team struggle with writing user story. We don't find them simple. Yeah, I think this is a skill. Writing user stories is a skill, and if you are struggling, probably you need some coaching or mentoring on that. So so find out a coach, an agile coach or mentor near you who can help you in simplifying things for you. Maybe there is not a good understanding of user stories. Maybe there is a old mindset. So there could be many reasons that you're struggling with, and that's not unusual. That's not unusual. I have seen it in many teams, many organizations, that they're able to do the sprints and all those things. Here is the biggest struggle: how to write good user stories, how to make sure that they follow invest criteria, how to make sure that you don't end up writing epics and not stories. So there is some education needed. There may be some coaching needed. So look for that. There's another question here, Marcia. Do you know how PMI handles CU for multiple credentials? If you have PMP and get your need 120 hours to renew, 120 hours to renew. No. So for this webinar, you get one PDU. It's not, PMI doesn't say CEUs. It says PDUs. So you get one PDU for PMP and one PDU for ACP. You can apply for both if you attend one event. So it's not that you have to do 60 for PMP and then 60 for ACP. No. You still have to get those, but in some cases, if whatever event you attended, if it was not related to Agile at all, then you may not get the PDUs for Agile. But if it is related to both, you get for both. But you need to get 60 here and 60 here. Many of them can be common. Okay, very good. So any other question? I'm just looking at the chat box here and see if there are any questions.
Hello?
Yes? Somebody wanted to say something?
The line went quiet. I was afraid it had dropped.
Okay. Okay. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Okay. So thank you. Thanks a lot. We'll see you on 9th July.